Welcome, everybody. My name's Justin Rood, and I'm the director of the Congressional Oversight Initiative here at POGO. I'm going to be moderating today's session. For those of you who are familiar with our traditional trainings, the rules are the same. They're open to all congressional staff, regardless of party, chamber, or position, and that includes GAO and CRS. We are nonpartisan and non-hierarchical. Our interest is making sure that you all get the best information that you need to do the best job you can overseeing the federal government. Today's topic is oversight of state and local law enforcement conduct and policies. We're joined by two fantastic subject matter experts, and I can't wait to get started. This is the second part of a two-part training. A week ago, last Thursday, we hosted a session on how to drill down into federal grant and equipment transfer programs like the DoD 1033 program and see what equipment and other support federal agencies are sending to your district and state. A video recording of that session is available, and you can find it on our website and online. These two sessions are supposed to help offices who are wondering what role the federal government has played in up-arming and militarizing police in your state or district, how to answer questions regarding how that equipment is being used, and if the department's record and need justifies the increased access to these tools, especially tools of violence. This offering is part of our Oversight Summit. Originally, the summit was planned as an in-person conference for this fall. It's been postponed because of the pandemic until next spring. But throughout the year, we'll be holding virtual events like these with ourselves and good government partners to engage with the oversight community at large on some of the really serious challenges that we face at the moment. To make sure that you receive updates to the virtual summit events, you can subscribe using the link that we'll be posting in the chat window. Real briefly, before we get to today's session, I want to talk about Crowdcast, which is the platform we're using. It's a lot like Zoom, except where it's not. The first thing is you will only be seeing the presenters. You won't be seeing the audience. You all are off camera and muted. So no concerns there. Feel free to carry on as you would if no one was watching. You can communicate by using the chat window on the right side. If you'd like to ask a question, however, there's another function called Ask a Question, which you'll see there at the bottom of the screen. You can click there and enter your question, and we'll be using that to drive our Q&A section at the end. You can also upvote questions, so if someone else has asked your question, you can upvote it and it'll be more likely to be answered. This presentation will also be recorded and posted online, but any Q&A that we have won't be. One of our rules is that our presentations are on the record, but our question and answer sessions are off the record to encourage folks to ask questions that they may find challenging, delicate, stupid, but there is no such thing as a stupid question, which is why we want to make sure they all get asked. Finally, I want to introduce our presenters for today. Beryl Lipton is a senior reporter for MuckRock, also a self-described queen of the FOIA Freaks. MuckRock is a fantastic collaborative nonprofit news site that makes government more transparent by bringing together journalists, researchers, and others to request and share official documents. It's an incredible resource for topics across the board, and you should check it out. Freddy Martinez comes to us as a policy analyst from Open the Government. Freddy is an activist, security engineer, and previously a physicist, although I don't think you can ever stop being a physicist, can you? Prior to joining OTG, Freddy was the executive director of Lucy Parsons Labs, a Chicago-based police accountability nonprofit. Both of those organizations, MuckRock and OTG, are fantastic resources on this issue and others, so I really encourage everybody to get to know them and build relationships with those organizations going forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Beryl and Freddy.
Great. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, so Freddy and I are very excited to be talking to you today about an issue very near and dear to both of our hearts, police accountability, and also getting access to records and other information that'll help sort of make that effort more effective and more compelling, because I know that there's a lot of different shareholders who are interested in both sides of police accountability. So in your positions, there are a few ways of getting information that we're not really going to cover that are more specific to you and less specific to sort of the way that people in the public get information. Of course, there's sort of open data resources and Government Accountability Office and Congressional Research Service reports and these sorts of other data collection efforts. And a lot of our expertise, of course, is in the Freedom of Information Act and public records laws and sort of working with those to get closer to data and also to identify gaps in where in the data. And just before we begin, I wanted to just sort of lay out like a couple of things in the area of police accountability that we might want to consider. You know, when we're talking about police accountability, what is it that we're actually trying to hold them accountable for? And I think we'll probably thread a few of these different things throughout our conversation, but sort of basically breaking it down to sort of like, how are they getting their job done? Are they getting their job done? How are they treating residents and other individuals as they're trying to get this job done? And also, how are they sort of abusing taxpayer trust and funds as they perform their duties? So just like a brief overview, FOIA requests and FOI requests in general are very useful for sort of accessing a lot of different types of data. So we're not necessarily just looking at explicit uses of force or explicit engagement with military or military equipment necessarily, but sometimes a lot of these different elements obviously play with one another. FOI can be used to get better data on funding, on spending, on partnerships, on strategies, on tactics, and of course on misconduct, both substantiated and alleged. So there's a lot of data out there. And of course, just sort of like with any learning experience, the way that you piece it together is going to help you address your questions and solve your problems and ideally build better policy for everybody. We also, FOI requests can help you get a really good idea of just sort of the nitty-gritty basics of a workflow or the different policies that an agency on the local level or in your state is using. And also a better understanding of the relationships that they're building, because that's something that we'll be talking a lot about, is just sort of the different relationships, obviously, between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement, but also between local law enforcement and vendors, community members, unions, and foundations, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to kick it over to Freddy for key things to watch for.
I guess a few key takeaways we want the audience to come away with. Number one is that no matter what position you're in, the data that you're going to get is going to be often very incomplete, and it's going to be very messy. So no matter how big the police force is, you might be getting Excel spreadsheets, or every email that you get sent is an individual PDF, or the data set that you get sent is missing columns, or there's no context. So just be aware, like right off the bat, that no matter what position you're in, the data is often very incomplete. It's going to be hard to link together with other data sets. So the picture you're going to get is very incomplete. Obviously, context is important and will help you sift through records and get a better picture. But that's not the whole story. So just be aware that that's a very common issue for all of us that you're going to run into almost immediately. And the story that it'll tell will be an incomplete story. We'll talk about the different ways that misconduct, misspending can be sort of out in the open, but it can also get buried. So the story you're going to find as you do your investigations is going to be an incomplete story. So just be aware also. A lot of the ways that people do sort of oversight and transparency is by looking at official documents, the policies that police departments have, the forms that they fill out. We often will go to, like, for example, the search warrant. You have to file for a search warrant, and you have to file it with a judge, and then you have to store that warrant somewhere in some database somewhere. So we'll go to the database that the police directive says you have to follow. So directives and official forms are often very revealing and often a great place to get started. Obviously, the amount of information you're going to be able to get through FOIA or any kind of public disclosure laws will vary by state to state and by municipality to municipality. And then a lot of times you will often run into issues where data will be considered non-public for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's considered, if you ask for the database structure of something, they'll tell you that because Oracle designed the database, that's somehow proprietary, so you won't be able to get access to it. So you'll run into a lot of issues about non-public data. Your U.S. staffers should have an easier time of it, but definitely won't be a full. You won't get full access as you might expect.
Cool. So we're going to try to highlight as we go some places where we think that there could be sort of, just sort of basic accountability or measures taken to try to improve things a little bit. But overall, we'll be running through sort of just police misconduct records, union contracts, use of force policies, and then we're going to sort of touch on police militarization and also some data-driven policing techniques, which sort of goes a little bit further beyond the immediate problem, but definitely affects this particular issue.
Yeah, and I just kind of we'll give you a few examples of the kinds of things you will see as you're doing your investigations. So when I mentioned that police data is incomplete or missing, let me just give you an example. So I did a Freedom of Information Act request in Illinois to the police department in Chicago, and I asked for 5 years of search warrant data, and the third largest police department in the country told me that they don't have any. So it's not possible that they have no search warrants over a 5-year period. It's the third largest city in the municipality in the country, and so we fought it on appeal. Our appeal was successful. The data that we got then had 20% missing. So it had no location and no judge signed off on it, but it was like an executed search warrant. And then we went back to the police department. We asked them again, well, how this is possible. They, said, okay, it's because the ways that we're searching for the data is incomplete. And then they gave us more complete data, and even that data, we couldn't make sense of why like a bunch of addresses were repeating. And then we looked a bit deeper, and then we realized what we were actually looking at is sort of search warrants that were executed at the police department, which likely means that it was like a cell phone search pursuant to a warrant being done by police officers. And so that kind of like is a story of just how and this was a 2-year battle just to get search warrant data. So you can imagine that this is the case across the country. This is not exclusive to Chicago, and you would hope that like the third largest police department in the country wouldn't be the case, but it unfortunately is like sort of a standard story.
Yeah, and just jumping off of that, right? On the federal level, there are a few different initiatives and agencies who are tasked or interested in sort of collecting this data. And unfortunately, a lot of that, there is no sort of federal, like meaningful federal data set of a lot of these issues. So, there have been multiple attempts at collecting use of force data across police departments. One of the most recent efforts was from the FBI. As of, May, they said that only about 40% of police departments in the country were actually participating. And sort of similarly, we see that with the Bureau of Justice Statistics as well, because, these reporting requirements actually aren't requirements, they're voluntary. And so a lot of these data sets are missing huge chunks. And, with BJS a few years ago, they were collecting data on officer-involved shootings and fatalities, but because that information was so incomplete, they ultimately stopped that version of the data collection efforts, and we're working on establishing a new system or methodology for getting this information. And so just reiterating, a lot of these data sets, because you can't force local agencies to be providing actually robust and accurate information, a lot of them are themselves incomplete and inaccurate. And so there are a few opportunities perhaps to make mandatory some of these reporting requirements. One way that we would maybe suggest is in consent decrees, which are some of the the most direct ways that the federal government can come in and enact some structure on a department. But even recently, you know, there was just a recent report that came out that said that the Chicago Police Department had missed more than 70% of its deadlines under their consent decree. So, you know, it's one thing to be told by the federal government that there's some sort of punishment in place, but compliance with those expectations is pretty variable. Yeah. Freddie, would you like to talk more about misconduct records?
Thank you, Beryl. So in most states, all of them except for 13, through either the state law or through another form of rule, police misconduct records are not public. So this is a huge challenge. So you might have rules, for example, that because of the union contract, misconduct records are not made public. So this was the case in New York until about 2 weeks ago. There are other these are very common issues that you might run into. So we have a little map where you might see them. Yeah. But I would say that just because misconduct records are not public in any kind of meaningful way or on a rolling basis does not mean that you can't find misconduct. In general, there's a lot of types of misconduct, and you can even use the little bits that are available, that are public, as a stepping off point. So for example, any kind of in most places, settlement data for police misconduct is public, because it's overseen by a judge. So there was a group in Chicago that tabulated how much money was spent, and it was over $500 million in 10 years. And then they did a spreadsheet of all of the officers who were co-accused with each other, which ones were repeatedly costing the city tons and tons, hundreds of millions of dollars, and made that information public. Another way that you can think about, let me see here. Yeah, for when misconduct is made public, data is made public, often, you know, assuming that you can make it into some kind of meaningful data set that you can analyze. You know, I think there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice the data. There was in Chicago, if you're white, I think you're twice as likely to have your misconduct complaint taken seriously and actually investigated. But then there's also a breakdown between like gender. So if you're a white woman versus a black man filing a misconduct complaint, there's a disparity of even 400%. And there's other types of kinds of misconduct built into that data too, or sort of disparities. If you're a black police officer, for example, misconduct allegations are twice more likely to be considered valid against you than a white officer. So there's a lot of ways to think about like how the data can be analyzed. There was obviously all sorts of like maybe neighborhood mappings about which neighborhoods are getting their allegations taken seriously versus which ones are not. So there's a lot of ways to think about it. So yeah, you'll be surprised what kinds of stories you can tell if you actually can get the misconduct data. But as I said, the data is incomplete. Often it's challenging to track like individual officers. So many and most departments will not make an employee ID number sort of public for lots of different reasons. And so what that means is if I have misconduct data here and like lawsuit data here, and the names maybe aren't, there might not be a way to like link the two names together, because they'll say like that's considered a personnel record and that's considered a personnel record. And so linking like disparate data sets is really hard to do. And this is a very common challenge across the country. So if you can get something like, not like a badge number, because those, you know, in Chicago, those can rotate. But if you can get like an employee ID number or some unique signifier, most departments have them. You should absolutely fight tooth and nail to get it, because without it, you're really swimming upstream. the other way to think about data is that it's often incomplete, or you have to think about it a little bit. So for example, in many places, the race is considered white for like Latino, Hispanic people. So often, even like if you have a really good data set, it's hard to break it down and really actually like get into the racial disparities within that data set. Similarly, for other departments, they just don't collect data. So across the US, but especially in tribal lands, like they just don't collect data on missing women, for example. So there's a huge collection problem. There's a huge analysis problem. So just be aware that all of those things exist as you're doing your investigations. And then finally, consider a few other things, like misconduct data has to go through a life cycle of a complaint. So you collect a complaint, and then it gets investigated. That's supposed to take 90 days. It could take 2 years. Then the police department's supposed to make some, or the independent review agency is supposed to make some recommendation. And most police departments have a arbitration clause or something like that, where the officer can challenge that, maybe through a union contract rule or something like that. And then that could take years. And then once that issue is resolved, then maybe the final actual punishment gets put into place. And so you can imagine at each of these processes, there's a lot of breakdown in really what is an accountable process, what is a transparent process. So you often hear these stories where someone makes a misconduct complaint, and then 7 years later, they realize that officer never actually like had to take unpaid time off for that abuse. Those kinds of things happen all the time, and like being aware that these misconduct complaints go through a life cycle, and thinking about all of the ways that people dodge accountability along the way would be a very important thing to be thinking about.
I would just like to jump in and tag something onto that point. I think in terms of if we're thinking about police trust, we're pretty used to government operations taking a little bit longer than we would maybe expect that they would. But I think if we're thinking about building public trust, the fact that, even seemingly minor infractions take years and years for some sort of accountability, that's the sort of thing that's hard to dig oneself out of, because that's, time is real to people. It's not government time.
Yeah. Right. And just to finish sort of other kinds of misconduct you can think of, thinking about this misconduct that's in data that's already public. So for example, every year for like the last 3 years, the highest paid employees in Boston are police officers making over $300,000, over half of that in overtime pay. So you can imagine like how much overtime they're actually making in number of hours. And then I think the NPR affiliate or similar, we have the link, did an analysis, and they realized that over the last decade in Boston, the overtime pay has gone up 84%, and for no real discernible reason. In Chicago, the Inspector General did a report and analysis and found that officers seemingly always seem to catch a felon on the way back into the police station, and would get overtime for processing and booking the felony and going to court. And very suspicious timing, and it seems to indicate that the arrests were driven not by sort of criminal justice issue, but because of a monetary issue. And those kinds of things are public and a lot easier to get access to than maybe official police misconduct records. And then I will wrap up on the use of force and sort of a few different ways to be thinking about it. I think we should really be cautious about the reporting of use of force in lots of different ways, and I'll give a few examples. So the DOJ, when they were investigating the Chicago Police Department, one of the things that came out in its report said when the police shoot at someone and they don't hit them, it's not registered as a deadly use of force. Or it's not investigated in any kind of way. So use of force is often very underreported, or it's reported in ways that you should be like there should be some yellow flags. So for example, police often will often use this term emergency takedown procedures when they tackle someone or whatever it is like that. But I've reviewed records where it was like a 200-pound police officer body slamming a 14-year-old girl to the ground, and she, I guess, was getting arrested, and she twisted away from her handcuffs, and the guy body slammed her onto the ground. And they call it emergency takedown procedure. So just be aware that there are like different ways to hide misconduct in just the official reporting. And then also consider sort of what kind of reforms might do with reporting changes. So in 2016, every time that police would stop and frisk someone, they had to like write this huge long narrative about why they did it, and collect a lot more data. And unsurprisingly, the number of stop and frisks plummeted in Chicago. And at the same time, DUI stops like exploded in Black and brown neighborhoods, and of course not in white neighborhoods. So the pretext for stop and frisk really moved from walking on the street to driving in a car, and actually driving in a car has a lot less constitutional protections than you do walking down the street. So just be aware that like these kinds of changes to policies will have network effects, and to think about what are those network effects and how can you investigate those as well. I think that's what I have. Oh, and then I'm sorry, just finally, one final point about the use of force. Oftentimes the use of force just doesn't get reported. Like last month at the protests in Chicago, you would see there's tons of videos of cops sort of attacking crowds, hitting people with batons, hitting them with their bikes. And a journalism group just did an analysis of the use of force considered, and like somehow 6 officers jumping on one person and beating them is not considered a use of force. So consider, like, if you're going to do an investigation on use of force, consider all of the ways that it doesn't get reported, especially in sort of dynamic situations like that. Okay.
We're also going to run through a few other things. I know that you, or some of you, were in a session about the 1033 program and the transfers of surplus military equipment to local police departments. So I won't hammer on that too much more. But, that's the sort of program where, one, there's like a clear federal tie between to local police departments. And in the last few years, as there was growing public awareness that this program existed and a public demand for some transparency around it and a lack of transparency from the state level on it, the Defense Logistics Agency, which handles the administration of that program, began regularly releasing the transfers that they were making and to which departments, So that's a really good data set, particularly for people on the local level. I think that's the sort of program that obviously is pretty controversial because it ends up with small towns and tanks and grenade launchers and all sorts of insane military equipment, but also makes some level of sense when you, for example, look at Guam and see that they got, a lot of surplus hospital beds, and that seems like a good use of equipment. Something to keep in mind there, right? There are opportunities for government programs to be significantly more transparent and help in a way that'll assist state and local considerations of these policies. We also want to talk about surveillance. That's going to be a growing issue, obviously, already kind of an issue, but particularly now as we're distancing and discussing defunding, surveillance is going to continue to be controversial. Freddie, do you want to talk about facial recognition a little bit?
Yeah, so Beryl and I have spent a summer looking for facial recognition all over the country, and we just kept being told that we don't use facial recognition, and I was like, that's a great thing. But really what was happening was that the police departments would have sort of MOUs or intergovernment agreements where they would sort of share data with each other. So like one police department would have the facial recognition system and would have access to all of the counties around it, and they would send their mugshot data to this police department, and they would run it on their behalf. We also surprisingly found a lot of facial recognition use at fusion centers, which are supposed to, these local agencies that are supposed to ingest counterterrorism intelligence and disseminate it to local and federal partners. They were had a huge number of, at least I think we found at least 10 or a dozen examples of them using facial recognition technology. And then we also found lots of like private partnerships. So we found one instance where it was like it's like a professional association of retailers to do loss prevention, and so they would send images to the police department, and they were running facial recognition across the country. And so we were finding like these strange emails between police departments in Illinois and Florida, and it was related to bounce checks or that sort of thing. So just be aware that when you're looking into these kinds of novel surveillance technologies, they will not pop up where you think they will, and they'll pop up in sort of new, surprising ways, which is sort of a key lesson learned about the facial recognition project. And then likewise with smart city contracting, so we've seen places like Detroit where they roll out these sort of real-time cameras as part of a community engagement effort. And a few years later, they start adding facial recognition to the cameras in quiet. It caused a huge community outcry. And the police chief last month testified that their facial recognition algorithms are inaccurate 94% of the time. It doesn't work 94% of the time. So yeah, just be aware that like a lot of these smart city contracts aren't really about sort of like environmental. We want to really collect weather data for environmental decisions. That's not how they end up being used. So another example, the smart bulbs that were being used in San Diego for its smart city were being used last week to monitor protests around San Diego. So just be aware that smart city contracting is another avenue for surveillance. Beryl?
Yeah, I just want to quickly run through some algorithm related things. I think that's very close to the smart city conversation, because similarly to the way that police departments sort of across state boundaries are sharing information and techniques and strategies in a way that sort of circumvents some of the local regulations that might exist around those technologies. There's, across the board, a lot of problems with data sharing and data collection and the secondary data market in general. And so being really aware, for example, around predictive policing, if you are getting bad data, and for example, in Los Angeles, a police department was already under a consent decree, was already found to have been unequally applying their efforts. And then you use that data to then do predictive policing plans. Obviously, you've now used bad data to sort of institutionalize this strategy. And so thinking about ways that once one recognizes that there's data that's either being shared or analyzed and used improperly, how can we actually put some boundaries around that? Also thinking about sort of risk-based assessments. This comes up a lot in the court system, but similarly, we've heard a lot of stories about bias and where that data is coming from. And so keeping in mind how some of these, different data collection efforts that might be happening in social services or in some other areas might be funneling into law enforcement. So I know we're sort of running short before the Q&A time. So I do just want to jump down into the FOIA section really quick. So we use FOIA, obviously, Freedom of Information Act, that is the federal law. There's also an equivalent law in all of the states and territories, but we'll just use FOIA as the straightforward way of referencing this particular type of law. And MuckRock has a lot of FOIA 101 resources. If you Google MuckRock FOIA 101, you'll find a lot of them to talk about how to use public records in different states and around different issues. So I'm going to spare you a lot of the nitty-gritty details, but just very, very basically, sort of across the board in every state, obviously you're going to want to cite the law, be specific about which type of record it is that you're looking to get, be aware of how long an agency has to respond to you in general, be aware of the exemptions. So some of these exemptions vary from state to state, even though a lot of them do mirror the federal exemptions. This is something that you can use as you're sort of thinking through your investigation or trying to get different data, right? Some states will release data that other states won't. So take that into consideration. Obviously, you would be doing research as part of your sort of job. So, you do want to mention if you are going to file one of these requests on the local level, that this is in the public interest. And for the public good, that'll affect how much money they're ultimately going to try to charge a person. And then also consider appealing. As a layperson, we expect that almost every time we file a request, we're probably going to have to submit an appeal of some sort. So just be aware of that. And then sort of quickly to encapsulate some of the things that you might be wanting to do in advance of asking some of these questions, obviously just basic research, and keep in mind what there is for mandatory reporting. A lot of sort of our work is looking at where the government has already put in some sort of requirement and where agencies are not actually hitting that oversight requirement, right? So it's one thing to put into place an oversight mechanism. It's a whole other thing for that mechanism to actually work. So something to keep in mind. Of course, a lot of government activity requires writing. So anything that has been put into writing can be used in sort of bolstering your case for why a particular piece of information should be released. Really do consider sort of like the process. So if you are from a particular state and you are interested in, what the police procedures are like in that particular state, sort of asking for a higher level view of things like, what are your existing policies? What are your reporting requirements to your State Department of Public Safety? These sorts of questions are going to help you sort of identify where your answers are going to be. And something that MuckRock likes to tell our audience is that we encourage you to think like a middle manager, like where would somebody have put this in a filing cabinet? And then, of course, anytime there's a public admission of something that is useful for your FOIA request, I've had situations, and this isn't necessarily true across the board, but one, right, public admission, public statements, that sort of thing. But also, I have had situations where I have taken pictures of officers holding cameras at a protest and just said, I want all of that video. And so, just having something from the real world that says, I have a good sense that something here exists is obviously going to help your case. So if you have other questions about FOIA particulars, we'll be around. But Freddie, do you want to sort of run through a few last things before we?
No, I think we can hop into the Q&A just to reiterate really that we are a resource and we would love to talk to you. Even 2 years down the line, if you have a question, just feel free to call us. And a lot of this stuff is really from experience. So we're happy to. I often see people like, I'm struggling with X thing, and I'm like, oh, I did that 3 years ago. So please just really do use us as a resource because this is what we do. We have a lot of experience in it, but we've also faced the same challenges and frustrations that you might. So please don't bash your head against the wall the same way we did, and really just use us as a resource.
A tremendous amount. Freddie, are you able to hear me? Do I have volume? Great. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your offer of ongoing assistance for folks This is a really important issue. I don't think I'd have realized the level of the degradation or the poor quality of data. I admit to being a fan of The Wire many years ago and all of the stats and data-driven policing and all that stuff. So I just assumed they've gotten flooded with cash and they have all these crazy systems, and so everything should be all in neat rows and boxes. And it's disheartening to hear that it's almost as bad as things are at the federal level. So thank you very much for your insights there, as well as I think, again, the methods that are available at the state and local level to juke the stats and to reclassify information or incidents or use of force or things like that is really incredibly sophisticated, honestly, looking at it from the outside. Well, this concludes the on the record portion of our session. So thank you so much.